That was quick. Thank you. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the 2015 George Fox Conference. Our first speaker, the keynote speaker for the conference is Mr. Doug Most. He's an editor at the Boston Globe and the author of the book, The Race Underground. He's well respected in terms of the knowledge and content of the book. It's been rated by Amazon as one of the top books in 2014. There will be copies of the books available here for signing, and after Doug speaks, there'll be a signing session where he can autograph the books for you. So moving along, I'd like to introduce Mr. Most.
Thanks for the introduction, first of all. I'm happy to be here. I was really excited when I got this invitation. I want to thank Dave Klug and the whole organization for inviting me. This book was 5 years of my life. It's a long time. I know you can relate to the idea of a project taking many years. So for me, this was, I look at this book and I look at my son. I have a 6-year-old son, and I know that I started this book around the time he was born. We're very close, and so I know how old this project was, how long it took for me. So I'm going to talk about three things today. I'm going to talk a little bit about triumph. I'm going to talk a little bit about tragedy. I'm going to go back to triumph at the end, because these projects, which you build, which I wrote about, are all about both of those things. They're difficult. They're overwhelming. The scope of them can be incredible. But in the end, and this is one of the things I like to leave my talks with, I hope that people sort of have a new appreciation, a special appreciation for what went into building these projects. I certainly ride on subways now with a very different sort of understanding and appreciation for what went into them. And I try to impart that to other people, tunnels and bridges and things like that. The greatest opportunity of this century for New York City, comparable in its scope and effect to the creation of Central Park, begs for solutions, not for obstruction. The benefits are immense. The financial risks are insignificant. The complex stresses today, economic, social, racial, demand great actions. We have the ability, we have the imagination, we have the resources. Let's not be held back by fears of the future. Let's get on with it. Those were the words, and that was the vision of George Fox from 30 years ago. As everyone in this room knows, blocks away from here, a little tunneling project is proof that we are indeed getting on with it. What George Fox laid out with those words was so important in terms of overcoming obstacles. The second chapter in my book, which was sort of a late addition, and I think is now maybe my favorite chapter in the book, talks about overcoming fear. We take for granted today, when we ride on things underground, we take for granted this idea of going down there to travel, right? We stare at our phones, our iPads, our Kindles, our newspapers, whatever we're looking at. We just go. We don't even think about bounding down those stairs and riding on these trains that emerge out of nowhere. But centuries ago, man had this tremendous fear of the underground. There was this sort of idea that the underground was where the devil lived. That's where vermin lived, and no one wanted to go down there. The idea of traveling underground was very difficult for man to overcome. When London opened the world's first subway in 1863, there's this great anecdote that happened shortly before it opened. When the tunnel was getting ready to open, thousands of Londoners streamed to where the tunnel was going to be. They walked down steps to sort of look down the tunnel. Thousands of them sort of got to that bottom step, and they looked down that tunnel, and they took that final step and walked down there to check it out. Thousands more of them got to that bottom step, turned right around, and went back up. They weren't ready. They were not ready yet for this idea of going underground. So again, this idea that we travel underground today, it's not that new. It's an amazing concept, and people really were terrified of it years ago. In late October of 1903, workers digging the tunnel for New York subway in the neighborhood that we know of now as Washington Heights encountered more soft rock than they had anticipated. They had only a few hundred feet left to dig to connect the tunnel all the way through. At the time, the McHugh brothers, who were the subcontractors on the job, had been ordering 2 dynamite blasts per day. But to step up progress and to widen the tunnel to its required 25 feet, they began ordering 3 blasts, unaware of how much more dangerous that was to the project. At 10:30 p.m. on October 24th, the last blast went off, 110 feet below 193rd Street. It was customary at the time to wait a few minutes after a blast to let any loose debris fall. And you have to remember, back then, dynamite on big projects was a relatively new thing. Dynamite was not around for a long time. And the idea of sort of blasting through rock and other things in order to make progress was a relatively new phenomenon, especially on urban projects like the New York City subway. So this idea that they would set off a blast, and then they would wait 10 minutes to go underground. Today, of course, we would look at that and we would think, oh my God, 10 minutes is, not enough time, of course. But back then, that's sort of what they knew. So after waiting a few minutes to let any loose debris fall, a foreman named Timothy Sullivan went in to see if the walls were secure. "Come on in, boys," he shouted. "Let's get to work." What Sullivan could not see were 2 veins running through an enormous boulder in the ceiling that weakened it to the point where the slightest quake, never mind a dynamite blast, might cause it to split. First in was a young German electrician named William Schoit, whose job was to string up the lights to brighten the path for the others. Right behind him came Michael Hargraves and Charles Crocker, pushing a tram car to load up with rocks, and a larger group followed them. No sooner had they set foot back inside the tunnel when they heard 3 separate blasts. The workers who had yet to enter the tunnel turned around and bolted back up for the street, but those in front of them never had a chance. That 300-ton rock, which measured 5 feet wide and 45 feet long, crashed down on the laborers. Men were crushed and pinned and buried. 8 others were seriously hurt. An Italian worker by the name of Alfonso Anatello was crushed and had to have his leg amputated in order to be freed. But it still wasn't enough, as he died hours later at the hospital. From the streets, cries of agony could be heard. A local priest, the Reverend Thomas Lynch, was called in. With his ruddy face and kind blue eyes, he knelt in his black robe beside a few of the most severely injured men. And for one in particular, he touched his crucifix to the dying man's lips and said his prayer, "Lord, have mercy," as the others in the tunnel bowed their heads. The saddest moment of all came when Timothy Sullivan's body was brought to the street. His young son, Sammy, had been standing outside for hours, waiting and watching. When a tram car surfaced carrying his father's body, the boy walked beside it to the ambulance and left without a tear. A police officer walked up to him as they got into the vehicle, put his arm around the boy, and said, "I'm sorry for you, little man." The next day, the subway project engineer, William Barclay Parsons, arrived at the tragedy. He inspected the tunnel, emerged with his hands covered in blood and dirt, and he told a reporter somberly, "The rock was weaker than any of us knew." That was a tragedy. It was a horrible tragedy, one of the worst tragedies in the New York subway project. Both the New York project and the Boston subway project, which was finished about 6 years earlier, both experienced horrible tragedies. In Boston, the worst happened on March 4th, 1897. On that day, which was 6 months before the Boston subway was scheduled to open in September of 1897. 6 months before the subway was to open, there was a gas explosion along the tunnel that blew 3 street trolley cars high into the air in a gigantic ball of fire. The blast was so powerful that a nearby clock tower was frozen at the time, 11:47 a.m. 10 people died in that blast, along with 3 horses that had been pulling the carriages. Those were the 2 probably worst tragedies on the projects. but they both exemplify different challenges that had to be overcome. One underground, one on the surface, trying to allow street transit to continue while the subways were built so people could continue to get around while these massive projects happened. And the other one underground, dealing with a relatively new technology, dynamite, trying to harness the power of dynamite while at the same time blasting underneath the city and pushing that tunnel forward. Speaking of sort of pushing tunnels forward, one of my favorite stories from the book is the story of Alfred Beach. So you talk about a triumph. Alfred Beach, for those of you who don't know, was sort of a skinny little opera-loving inventor from the mid-1800s. He was a guy who loved to tinker with his hands. And in the mid-1800s, he had this idea that he was going to build New Yorkers a subway. The problem was at the time that no one had ever sort of proposed that idea. This is sort of 1850, at the time when the London subway wasn't even open yet, and Alfred Beach was determined to tunnel under Broadway, as he said. The idea was laughed at, and mocked, ridiculed, and Beach was sort of told to go back to where he came from. But he wouldn't give up. He saw something that London did when London opened its subway in 1863, and even saw something that they did after that, where they opened a mail tunnel under the city to move mail. And they moved it through a tunnel, a small tunnel, with a pneumatic tube, just like we think of today, or we used to think of maybe with those pneumatic tubes at banks, where the canister gets sucked up by a giant fan. Well, he was intrigued by that idea of a fan sort of pushing something along. So he proposed something, and in 1867, in New York City, at something called the American Institute Fair, he unveiled this pneumatic tube idea that was going to move people on a subway through New York. People were fascinated by it. 1867, this was a great time in American history, and people sort of saw this little tube, this car that was about 12, 14 feet long, and it would be pushed down a track by a little fan, or actually by a powerful fan, and then he would reverse the fan, and the car would be sucked back. At the American Institute Fair, thousands of people rode on this little contraption that he invented. And he crowed after it was all done. He was the owner of Scientific American magazine. And he crowed when it was all done that this is the future for New York. My pneumatic subway. This is going to be the future. Of course, Alfred Beach had one hurdle to overcome. It was a 300-pound crime boss by the name of Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed at the time was sort of at the height of his power. He was taking a nickel out of every bus fare in the city and earning a small fortune in the process. And the idea of a subway coming along and stealing passengers from the buses and moving people in a completely different way, independent of his corrupt system, was not going to happen. Boss Tweed sort of told Alfred Beach, you can take your subway back to where you came from, but there will be no subway in this town. Alfred Beach was unlike some of the other opponents that Boss Tweed had encountered. He was stubborn and determined, and he was not going to back down. So he went to the state legislature, and he sort of very sneakily snuck a bill through the state legislature. First, he said he wanted to just build a little tunnel to move mail through the city. Boss Tweed looked at that proposal from Beach very suspiciously and carefully, but he sort of examined the measurements that Beach was proposing for this underground tunnel, and he said that could never move people. And he approved it. Beach then went back a couple months later. Boss Tweed was distracted now by some other things. And Beach said, I just want to make some modifications to my tunnel. Slight modifications. Make the tunnel just a little wider. Make the car just a little bigger. Boss Tweed, like I said, was sort of distracted and didn't really pay too close attention to these slight modifications that Beach wanted to make. But that was critical, because those slight modifications were just big enough for Beach to build something very different. And that modification passed, and he got what he wanted. He got the charter that he needed to build. He created the Beach Pneumatic Transit Company. And in 1869, he rented a little space underneath Devlin's department store on the Lower East Side, and he built, in complete secrecy of the city, a 312-foot tunnel. This tunnel was like nothing you can imagine. First of all, it was built by a tunneling shield, one of the very first tunneling shields, pushed forward an inch at a time through the ground. He also built a car, a subway car that was sort of round and cylindrical in shape, that would seat about 20 people or so. He brought in a giant fan called the Western Tornado from Indiana, which was going to blow this car down the tracks. His idea was to have one station. Again, this was just an experiment that he was building. One station. You would get on the car, sort of near the Murray Hill neighborhood. You'd be blown down the tracks 312 feet. You couldn't get off at the other end. Then the fan would be reversed, and the car would be sucked right back to its starting position. The station that he built, and he was very cognizant of the fact, again, what we talked about at the beginning, that people were terrified of the underground. He's very cognizant of the fact that people would be nervous about going underground to ride on this thing. He built a station like nothing you've ever seen. Chandeliers, goldfish tanks, pianos, grand settees, beautiful couches for women to sit on while they waited for the next ride. This was like your beautiful living room in a mansion somewhere. This was not your typical subway station. A reporter for a New York newspaper snuck in and got a glimpse of his tunneling project a couple weeks before he was ready to unveil it, and wrote a report about it in the paper. So then the secret was out of the bag. He invited the press down. He invited the public into this tunnel. Boss Tweed was none too happy to learn that a secret subway tunnel had been built literally feet from his office, just across the street. Thousands of people came down and paid a small amount of change, maybe a quarter, to ride on this subway. 1 block. And it was the greatest thing ever. They were so excited by it. The papers declared, Alfred Beach has done it. He's built something that will be the future of New York City. Of course, people weren't really thinking about whether this pneumatic fan would really be able to blow cars all over the city. But for now, it could blow one car 300 feet. And that was enough for Beach and other New Yorkers to get very excited. But Boss Tweed, of course, wasn't going to have it. And over the next year or two, Boss Tweed and Alfred Beach really went to battle. They fought, they bickered, and in the end, there was something called Black Friday, which bankrupted Alfred Beach, almost down to his last penny. And his tunnel never got built, at least a bigger tunnel. Boss Tweed was arrested, of course, years later, and Beach's tunnel was turned into a shooting gallery, a wine cellar, and eventually it was just sealed up. Late in the project, in the 1890s, you could often see a solitary figure sitting down there, white hair, sitting on something that looked like a milk crate. And it was reported that that was Alfred Beach, sort of down there, just sitting by himself, sort of wondering what might have been. I love that story for a lot of reasons. If for no other reason than what Alfred Beach gave us was hope. He provided people with the idea that man could do great things. Even though his project never got built beyond that 300-foot tunnel, he put the idea out there that we can build a tunnel. We can do this. We just need better technology. We need a better tunneling method. We obviously need a better technology to move the cars, all of those things. But the idea that he had this grand vision and he did not let obstacles get in his way is, I think, a great lesson and a great message for a lot of people to take away from what he achieved. So his story is sort of one of my favorite stories. I mentioned briefly William Parsons. Parsons is one of my favorite characters in this book for a lot of reasons. The biggest, I think, is perhaps that he was as passionate about the subway as I was probably for 5 years writing this book. Early on in 1891, Parsons sort of fanned out across New York City with an army of workers. And I love this image that I read about. He went out there with an army of workers, and their job, their task, was to literally punch holes in the ground. As you all know, New York is essentially a giant rock. And he was trying to determine the shape of that rock. And so what he was doing was punching holes in the ground to determine how deep it was at certain spots. So he would punch a hole, in the Upper West Side and discover that it went way down, but then he'd go downtown to Canal Street and discover maybe it went only 12 feet. So he discovered sort of how the shape of the rock, if you almost turned Manhattan upside down, it was like a giant mountain range upside down. It was really, the depths were so different. but he was so determined to get a mental picture of the island. At one point, he was actually on a court stand. He was testifying in a trial, and the lawyers who were sort of questioning him were trying to stump him with questions about New York City. And they would throw questions at him left and right about what he knew, and he could answer every question. It was like he had a photographic memory of New York City. And they walked out of that hearing completely just stymied, essentially gave up. And they said that he's too smart, too good, knows too much, and we should sort of maybe take another tact in this trial. That trying to flummox and stump William Parsons was a fruitless effort. So the subway project had so many fascinating characters. Another one who I write about a lot in the book is William Steinway. When we think about the name Steinway in American culture today, of course we think about the Steinway piano. And he was that Steinway. He's the guy who brought the Steinway piano manufacturing industry to New York. But the other thing he did is he was named chairman of the New York City Transit Commission. And he chaired the committee for almost a decade in terms of looking at and studying the New York City subway project and trying to figure out a way to make it succeed. He and Parsons worked very closely together. Steinway did a great thing. One day, this is one of my favorite anecdotes from the book. In 1894, there were several votes on whether to build the New York City subway. Before one of them, in 1894, Steinway was particularly nervous. He was not optimistic that things were going to go as he hoped they would go. That night, before this big vote the next day, he went to bed, and before he went to bed, he had a Pilsner. He sent his staff home for the evening, and he went to bed that night dreaming of burglars breaking into his house. And I love that story for a couple of reasons. First of all, it shows his state of mind. He was genuinely nervous about this big vote that was going to happen in New York City. I also love it because as a reporter and as a researcher and as someone who sort of really dove into archive materials, I love it because I hope that people sort of read that and hear that and wonder, how does he know what William Steinway was dreaming in 1894? The reason I know it is because William Steinway was kind enough and smart enough to keep a detailed diary of his life. He wrote everything down. And he left that diary behind. And that diary is now in the hands of the Smithsonian Institution. You can actually look it up digitally. And so I did that for a lot of the research on William Steinway's life. And I was able to read about his state of mind and what was going through his head. And sure enough, in 1894, he has this entry where he writes about that night. And he writes about dreaming of burglars breaking into his house. It's just a great little nugget that sort of shows you how people were dealing with the issues of the day, what they were thinking of, what was going through their minds. But also, as a reporter and as a researcher, I found that just a fun thing to show you sort of the detail that I tried to include in the book to sort of tell the lives of some of these key people. So the final story I want to tell you, I want to go back to Triumph for a minute. When Boston and New York opened their subways, they handled it very differently. Boston opened its subway at 6 in the morning, okay? 6 in the morning. They essentially just put a regular motorman onto one of its trolley cars. He drove it out of the shed, drove it down Boylston Street, if you know Boston at all, drove it down Boylston Street in Boston, and stopped right before the tunnel entrance. People waved some flags. There was a crowd out there. There were no speeches. There was no grand celebration. It was just, here's the subway. We built it. Get on board. That was how Boston did things back then. Very subdued, quieter. They didn't need to tout this project to the world. New York, on the other hand, when they opened their subway, October 27th, 1904. When New York opened its subway, an entire day of celebration was planned. Subway was not scheduled to open until 7 p.m., not 6 a.m. The entire day was filled with speeches from William Barclay Parsons, from August Belmont, the financier who put the money up behind the project, from John B. MacDonald, the burly Irish contractor who was the lead contractor on the subway project, who built much of the tunnel. They were all there for the celebration and to give speeches and to sort of celebrate this great moment in American history. When Boston opened its subway, they opened about 2 miles of track after about 3 years of construction, not quite. It was scheduled to cost about $5 million. They finished it for $4.2 million, under budget. New York, on the other hand, when they opened their subway in October of 1904, opened 20 miles of tracks. Much bigger project, bigger in scope, deeper, like I said before. Both cities used the cut and cover method for a lot of their projects, but New York also had to dig very deep on other parts of the project. As we know, up in Washington Heights, where I described that horrible tragedy, they had to dig way down deep to really get around some of the obstacles they had to dig. So New York opened its subway in 1904. I'm going to read you just a short passage from that day. It was an enormously exciting day for New York City. And like I said, very different from the way Boston opened its subway. Whereas Boston sort of was very subdued, New York was the opposite. New York did not just let anybody ride that first subway car. It was not just a regular motorman. New York's first subway car was driven by none other than the mayor. At the time, the mayor insisted on driving that first subway car. I'm just going to read you a short passage from that exciting day. It was interesting for a lot of reasons. There's a couple spots where I can read from. I have a good one marked off here. Outside City Hall, a sea of 5,000 people covered the steps, filled the plaza, and surrounded the kiosk of the City Hall station. It was 2:30 in the afternoon when a procession of men in tall silk top hats and long black frocks came down the steps. As Frank Headley, the subway's general manager, led the group toward City Hall kiosk, they were greeted by cheers and applause that drowned out the tooting factory whistles, the horns of ferries and tugs from the nearby harbor, the chiming of church bells. Headley opened the station door and the group, with McClellan still holding that mahogany case, descended the steps to the platform. A shiny silver subway train with 8 cars attached sat there, and in seconds it was filled above capacity with the officials and a few dozen thrill-seeking stragglers who'd managed to sneak in behind them. In the front car, McClellan opened up the case to reveal a silver key, and Headley took it and reached to slide it into a hole on the motor, only to be momentarily stymied. "It doesn't fit very well," he said. But after tinkering for a few seconds, he succeeded, and with a sudden hissing noise, the electric motor buzzed to life. Headley leaned in over to McClellan with some last-minute instructions. "Are we ready?" the mayor hollered. "All right," Headley answered, while keeping his hand on the emergency brake. "Slow at first, remember?" Mayor McClellan was a young and clean-shaven mayor with dark, wavy hair, and he cut a dashing figure. A city alderman by the time he was 27, he was elected mayor over Seth Low in 1903 at the age of 38. His father had run against Abraham Lincoln for president and been a famous Civil War general. Though McClellan had no formal role in the subway's approval or construction, he was certainly savvy enough to realize that his citizens were clamoring for it. And on his first day in office, he took a tour of the tunnels to show his interest and appreciation. Unlike his immediate predecessors, who were voted out of office in a year or two, McClellan proved popular to last 5 years, and during his term, his fondness for huge public works projects grew, as he oversaw the construction of the Queensboro and Manhattan bridges. For the subway, he merely benefited from arriving in office at the right time. And he made history when he pushed his hand forward and began the first subway ride in New York's history. The car rounded a corner and the lights of the Brooklyn Bridge station came into view. The car jerked to a stop without warning when the emergency brake was accidentally bumped, causing everyone on board to lurch forward. But the mayor got the hang of things and had the subway moving again in no time, picking up speed while Headley blew the train's whistle to warn track workers that they were coming. As they pulled into the Spring Street station, McClellan turned to Headley. "Shall I slow her down here?" he said, talking as if he'd been a motorman his whole life. "You're going slow enough," Headley answered, "but aren't you tired of it? Don't you want the motorman to take hold now?" Like a boy playing with his new toy, the mayor shot back with a quick reply. "No, sir, I'm running this train." And run it he did. Zooming up 14th Street along 4th Avenue, McClellan pushed the train faster, his passengers behind him, oblivious to how nervous he was making Headley. They passed idling trains that had not yet been allowed to start and flew by track workers and ticket takers and guards, who doffed their hats and cheered as the special train zoomed through. Into Grand Central they came, and then it was gone. A minute later, the passengers spotted a large electric sign, 4 feet high, 12 feet long, with a single word glowing: Times. Here, McClellan shouted out, "Times Square Station," but instead of slowing, he pushed the subway harder, up to 43 miles per hour, far faster than Headley had anticipated or wanted to go, in what was supposed to be a leisurely trip. Up the west side they went, past 66th Street, where Headley turned to McClellan with a plea: "Slower here, please, slower, easy on the curve." They passed a worker who neatly sidestepped the train when he saw it coming, and then glided toward the last express station at 96th Street, where it slid over a switch in the ground onto the northbound local track. 19 minutes the trip lasted, about 5 minutes longer than the express ride from the Brooklyn Bridge to 96th would normally take under the control of a professional motorman, but impressive nonetheless. It was after 96 when McClellan finally took his hand off the control and let the motorman on board, George L. Morrison, take over. McClellan took out a cigar, quickly lit it, and puffed, and shook his tired wrist. "Well, that was a little tiresome, don't you know?" he said. "You have to keep pressing that thing down all the time, for if you relax your hand, the train will stop." With Morrison now at the controls, the train continued north until, without warning, the passengers, who had been staring mostly at darkened tunnels, were suddenly looking out into the dusk. North of 122nd Street, the subway train emerged from the ground onto a viaduct that crossed Manhattan Valley. It was the only place where it ran in the open air, and New Yorkers who knew this precise spot came out to cheer it on, shouting from the streets and the rooftops. Morrison blew the train's whistle before it disappeared out of sight. By evening, the crowds were on the verge of bursting through the doors of the kiosks to get inside the station. A slogan that had been shouted for years and written in big headlines at one point or another by every newspaper in the city began to be chanted now in all seriousness, as it was possible. 15 minutes to Harlem, the cries rang out. Most of the men held nickels in their hands, while the women who lined up had 5 pennies, ready to hand over their coins in return for a green ticket. In the next 5 hours, 111,881 passengers would pay to ride the subway, and it seemed like every last one of them was standing outside a station somewhere across the city. The biggest crowds gathered at the express stations, from Brooklyn Bridge to Grand Central to Times Square, where more than 300 people filled the sidewalk and poured onto the street. On the platforms, the ticket sellers braced themselves, worried about being unable to collect their fares and terrified of being crushed. Every New York police officer was on duty and set out to protect the doors of the kiosks and stairways until permission to open them was received. It looked like a riot, but it felt like a carnival. The pushing and shoving was of the friendly variety, and anyone who had a free hand blew a whistle to keep up the party atmosphere. A few minutes before 7 o'clock in the evening of October 27th, 1904, a familiar ringing was echoed under the streets of New York. It was first heard in the uptown stations, and then quickly it began to be heard in the downtown stations. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, 30 years after its invention, was now as much a part of everyday life in New York City as the subway was destined to become. Telephones had been placed inside the stations to allow for the different managers to call each other and for emergency calls to be placed in the event a train had to be stopped. The ringing at this hour lasted just a few seconds, for when the station managers of the Interborough Rapid Transit Company answered the calls at their different posts across the city, they were all greeted with the same 3-word message: "Let him in." That's sort of how the New York City subway opened. Thousands of people lined up at these stations, waiting for the word that the stations were now open. The word came, and the subway opened. Of course, it would expand for many miles after that, but that first stretch was 20 miles. The route of the first New York subway, it's one of the questions I often get asked, the very first route that opened sort of started at City Hall, went up to the bottom of Central Park, around the west side of Central Park, and up right along the side of the park, sort of what we now think of as the AC&E line, and then up into Harlem and across the river. That was sort of the very first path of the subway. The East Side, which had been resistant to the subway project in the early years, did not get a subway until years later. Once they saw that it worked and that it was effective at pulling people off the streets, then they got on board with the idea. But the first subway went up the West Side, not the East Side. So this project, for many reasons, like I said, was both a project of triumph and tragedy. Many people died. More than 40 men, workers, died in various ways on this project over the course of its 4 years of construction. There was another horrible blast. One of the most important people who died was Ira Shaler, sort of nicknamed Voodoo. Ira Shaler was nicknamed Voodoo Shaler. He was one of the biggest contractors on the job, and he was in the Murray Hill neighborhood. They went underground with William Parsons. This was a scary moment for Parsons. They were inspecting one of the tunnels, and Shaler was trying to show Parsons how secure the tunnel was. So they went underground, and Shaler had with him a cane. And in an effort to show Parsons how secure and how well built and how the rock up above was completely safe, he poked at one of the rocks with his cane. It was not a smart move. As soon as he poked that rock, it came tumbling down and crashed on top of Shaler. Narrowly missed Parsons by feet. Parsons could have been crushed. He was not, but Shaler was. Shaler was crushed under a pile of rubble. And Parsons stood there and screamed for help, and workers came in and tried to pull him out. And Shaler hung on for a few days, but died a few days later. It's one of the worst tragedies on the project. It involved a major contractor on the job. But like I said, it could have been even far worse. Parsons was in grave danger in that accident. Parsons was one of these people who was very stoic. He sort of was very businesslike. Despite these tragedies, he was determined to not let any of them get in the way of progress. He would always approach them with a very sort of businesslike manner, and he was criticized for it by some people who said that he was almost bloodless and not warm to the emotions that were happening. But in the end, his businesslike approach really pushed the project forward. Final story I'd like to tell. This is just a personal anecdote. About 3 years ago, I was in New York City with my own family. I used to live on the Upper West Side around 79th Street. Came in for a weekend in the middle of writing the book. It was a rare weekend away with my wife and 2 little kids, and we got to take the 79th Street subway, went down to the station there. And for those of you who have kids, riding on the subway is sort of like a big carnival ride, right? It's an amusement park ride. It's a big deal. My memory of it is that my wife and I, we went down there with our kids. We sort of sat down on a bench waiting for the number 1 train. And our kids, who at the time were about 6 and 4, would run up to the yellow line and sort of peer down the tracks and then run back to us, sort of giggling, and run back to the yellow line and back and forth and back and forth. And at one point I took out my phone and I snapped a picture of them. And I have this picture on my wall now at home. What it shows is these 2 kids, these 2 wide-eyed kids, literally just like this, staring down the tracks, waiting for this sort of mysterious train to emerge out of this dark tunnel. They were going to get on board, and it was going to whisk them away someplace mysterious. They didn't know, had no idea what this experience was going to be like. It was just exciting, it was new, they couldn't wait. And I love that picture because I like to think that the anticipation and the excitement, all those emotions that those little kids were feeling that day had to be similar to what New Yorkers were anticipating on that day in October 27th, 1904. The idea of riding on a subway for the first time, getting on this dark, mysterious train coming out of this tunnel, whisking them away, what was that going to be like? So I'd like to close with that just because I hope that as all of us, and I know you especially, appreciate these projects, but I tell people at all the events I do that I hope we all have a newfound appreciation for these projects because they are immense, they are powerful, they are overwhelming in scope. But most important, they are impressive for what went into building them. It was men with their bare hands and their tools that sort of created these massive projects. So I'm going to stop there. I have time for 1 or 2 questions, but then I'm going to turn it right back over to the program. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Anything you wanted me to address that I did not, obviously could only address 1 or 2 things here. Any questions or any things you wanted me to address? Sorry. Thank you for reminding me. I brought a few pictures with me. I'll do real quick. So the earliest tunnels, as I talked about, were sort of dug by slaves, bare hands, sticks, and rocks. They would light a fire to light a rock and to heat up a rock, throw cold water on it to chip it away. And not surprisingly, when this happened, the fire sucked up the oxygen and hundreds died. And a new idea was needed. In 1841, the Thames Tunnel in London opened. Mark Isambard Brunel was the engineer who designed that tunnel, great engineer. And then as I talked about, 1863, London's tunneling shield digs the world's first subway. 1869, I talked about Alfred Beach and his secret subway. That's an illustration of that cylindrical car he built going through. I didn't get to talk about this today, but in 1888, the Great Blizzard was one of the pivotal moments in American history that forced cities to re-examine how they built their subways, how they built their transit projects. I think it's ironic we're looking at a picture of snow, given that the reason we're here today and not a month ago was a little bit of snow. 1895, Boston breaks ground on America's first subway, the cut and cover method. There you can see the cutting happening, starting with the covering. It's the Park Street Church there. March 4th, 1897, I described this explosion. That's a picture of the explosion that happened. Horrible blast, killed 10 people and a number of horses. And here, September 1st, 1897, Boston subway opens. There you have the great William Parsons. 1900, New York breaks ground. I love that picture. These guys just going out there with these axes and just breaking up the road. That's how it was done back then. Cut and cover method was used, but also deep tunneling was required. It's a great picture showing sort of the tunneling shield and sort of going through the ground. The subway took 4 years. As I talked about, dynamite, dozens of deaths. A tunneling shield was critical. These are pictures courtesy of a number of places, the New York Historical Society, New York Transit Museum. October 27th, 1904, New York subway opens. There you go. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Thanks for reminding me. I got distracted.
I'd like to thank Doug for his insight into the history of the New York City transit system and the underground work in New York. Doug will be around from about 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock to sign copies of his book outside in the lobby. The next speaker, mainstay part of the George Fox Conference, is the Tunnel Industry Update by Mike McHugh. Mike's Vice President of Moretrench America, graduate of Manhattan College, and will present the Tunnel Industry Update.
Thank you, Lonnie. The first thing I'd like to update is the progress that's been made on the 2nd Avenue subway line. Phase 1, as most of you have heard, known for a while, is a $4.45 billion project that runs up 2nd Avenue, which will provide service from 96th Street to 63rd Street. Overall, the progress on Phase 1 is 76% complete. A lot of the station work has been done at the stations, and we'll go over a couple of the ones that are up there. The 96th Street station was awarded to E. Cruz, Tully joint venture, back in 2012. And since then, they've also been working on the finishings. Right now, the project is the platform, mezzanine, and roof systems are done. They've completed the installation of the track work on the southbound tracks between 86th and 96th Street. Presently, they're working on some of the duct work. Last year, this was some early shots of the project. There was a cut and cover with slurry walls. Last year, we had the luxury at Mole Student Day to visit the site. We walked from there down to 86th Street through the tunnel, so the students with the moles got a good chance to see stuff. So these are some updated shots of how the area looks now and where it's heading. On the 86th Street, there's going to be the entrance on the corner of 94th, and here's a picture of the mezzanine area on the job. And there's some of the track work heading down to 86th Street. The next station down is 86th Street Station. That is a finishing contract that Skanska Trailer Brothers has. They were awarded in 2013. Again, this job is scheduled to be finished in the summer of 2016. The excavation is 100% done. They're working on finishing right now. They're about 15% complete on that. They are currently placing structural concrete in some of the entrances and the elevator shafts. And there's some pictures of the waterproofing and some of the concrete work that's going on inside the cavern areas. And again, we visited that spot last year too. The next phase on the job is the 72nd Street Station. Judd Law Contracting was awarded that project back in September 2013. Again, scheduled to be completed June of 2016. The upper mezzanine area, the concrete's finished, the lower mezzanine area is done, and they're working on the concrete for the platforms right now. There's also excavation work for the entrances going on, and for the ancillary structures 1 and 2, which is just about 95% complete for them. And here's some shots of the cavern area and some of the concrete work going on in there. And then the next part on 2nd Avenue Subway is going to be phases 2 through 4, which, depending on the Transit Authority's budgets, are supposed to be bidding between 2015 and 2020, waiting to see how that all pans out. Over on the East Side Access Project, there was a contract going on that Michael's Corp is doing. It's a $212 million job that they were awarded in 2013. They're about 60% complete, subject to probably be done in February of 2016 as well. The Manhattan Structures provides the fabrication and construction of permanent structural concrete lining and fit out for all the caverns and tunnels that were done underneath Grand Central Station. A little bit of an update: the West Cavern, the rebar and invert slab are complete. At the Grand Central tracks 1 and 2, the eastbound, again, rebar is all done. Rebar and concrete work has been done there. And the 38th Street vent plant, they've completed the concrete work there and are working on inverts. And there's some shots of the progress that they had in the fall of last year in November. Next project also on the East Side Access is the Manhattan North Structures, which Frontier Kemper was a low bidder on. They were awarded that job for $317 million back in April of 2013. Again, they're about 70% complete. They're projected to be finished in November of 2016. Their work consisted of the installation of the permanent lining and duct embedment for all the running tunnels and structures north of the Grand Central Caverns, and the construction of the 50th Street Air Cavern, Flume Cavern, and the underground ventilation facility at 55th Street. Right now, they're shotcreting any overbreak areas, following through the area, waterproofing, and reinforcing the slab and the transition areas. A couple of shots of the concrete work going on there. Next project also on that is Project Tudor Perini, had since 2011. They were projected to be complete a little while ago. They had a little bit of delays, but they're moving ahead with it. And their project was the architectural rehabilitation to the facilities along the 63rd Street Tunnel and the construction of the plaza interlocking below grade facilities for the main line traction and power substations. They're working on decking and installing concrete for the CO6 level, and they continue installation of waterproofing and the membrane, and they continue installing conduits on the project. Here's some photos of their progress. The next project in the area here is the New York City Rondout Tunnel. Currently, Schiavone is working on a project they were awarded of $100 million for the 2 shafts for the Rondout Tunnel, shaft 6 and Shaft 5B. Right now, Shaft 5B has been excavated approximately 400 foot deep using conventional drill and blast methods, and they're using a concrete cast-in-place liner on the top 170 foot of the shaft. On Shaft 6B, they're also down about 300 feet, again drill and blast, and putting in the entire excavation portion is getting a cast-in-place liner. Here's a couple of photographs of that. The upcoming work on the Rondout Tunnel is going to be bid, I think, in a month from now. And what that involves is a bypass tunnel that's pre-qualified bidders on it. And the Rondout Tunnel is a very important part of the New York City water system. It's part of the 85-mile Delaware aqueduct system that conveys about half of the city's water usage, or 500 million gallons a day. And currently there's a leak under the Hudson River that leaks out 22 million gallons a day, and they're afraid when they go to service it and fix it that the tunnel could collapse or have that flow coming back in. So currently what they're planning on is a bypass tunnel is being put in that's going to be 2.4 miles long. This tunnel is going to cost about $1 billion worth of work, and when it's subject to be completed in 2020, and during the time period, the city is going to have to take a lot of action to revamp the wells in Jamaica and come up with ways to save water usage in the city, because during the time period while the tunnel's down over the winter months during the tie-in, they have to watch the water consumption. And then just a quick thing on water tunnel number 3. Stage 3 is coming out, that they're planning on. The Kensico Tunnel will bid in a couple of years, depending on budgets, I guess. See where that goes. Next project to discuss is the Black River Tunnel. It's a project that Walsh Super Excavators is working on in Lauren, Ohio. It's a $53 million project. The job is a CSO, and it's planned on providing storage for 11 million gallons of sewage. It's a 5,500 foot, 23 foot diameter tunnel, and they're using a TBM shield to dig it. The launch and the reception shafts were both about 36 foot in diameter, and this project is well underway, and they had a breakthrough on the first run, 2014, and they're planning on completing the project this summer. Most of this tunneling was done through what's called Cleveland Shale, and it made a pretty fast excavation, but it was also a very challenging job in that they could dig faster than the conveyor system could keep up with it. So due to the geology, instead of using traditional concrete segments, ring beams and wire mesh lagging were used for the project. Some pictures of the beams. The next project, Ottawa, will be discussed later on, detail in the afternoon. As far as DC goes, there's 4 projects down there: the Blue Plains Tunnel, the Anacostia Tunnel, and the First Street Tunnel and North Boundary Tunnel. Later on today, there's a lengthy discussion on the Blue Plains Tunnel, so we will not be getting into that one too much. As far as the First Street Tunnel, that is a project that is Skanska JD's working on. Again, this work is for the DC Clean Rivers Project. The owner is DC Water and Sewer Authority. Skanska JD's project is a $157 million job. It involves construction of 2,700 foot, 20 foot diameter tunnel with depths ranging from 85 to 160 feet deep. The tunnel also consists of shafts and 3 satellite shafts. On the project to date, the project is about 35% complete, including the 3 shafts that were done. The support system on the shafts, they use ground freezing for the satellite shafts. And the excavation is taking place. Some of the slurry walls for the shaft were on other areas are 194 foot deep. The Adams Street shaft, again, was a combination of secant piles and ground freezing were employed on that one. And here's some pictures of the chaining shaft. That is one that was done with the slurry walls. And there's some pictures of the drilling operation for the freezing that was going on some of the shafts and some of the piping. The Anacostia River Tunnel is a project that was valued at $253 million, started in June of 2013. Healy, Parsons, and Prelio are the joint venture partners on it. To date, 3 of the 6 slurry wall shafts have been constructed. There was diaphragm wall used for M Street. Presently, the launch of the TBM has been delayed due to some ground loss in the Natum Tunnel section, which was being used for where the tunnel was going to be launched. So we won't show any pictures of that. Difficult to talk about them when there's issues on them. Northeast Boundary Tunnel is another DC project coming out in the future. It's going to be a length of 27,000 feet, 21-foot diameter tunnel, scheduled to bid in 2016. It is going to be between 40 and 160 feet below ground, and it will link the First Street Tunnel and the Anacostia Tunnel together for them to work. Next area to go into is Indianapolis and Dig Indy project. The Dig Indy project is a $1.6 billion long-term control plan that is going to take us through 2025. It's designed to store 250 million gallons of sewage to prevent overflows into the area, rivers, and streams. It's going to consist of 5 tunneling projects: the Deep Rock Connector Tunnel, which I'll get into in a minute here, the White River Tunnel, which is under design, which is 27,000 feet long. It's bidding next year. There's also the Fall Creek Tunnel, which is slated to bid 2016. That's also a 19,000-foot long tunnel. Then there's the Pleasant Run Tunnel, which is a 40,000-foot long run expected to start in 2020. And then the Lower Pews Run Tunnel is under design and scheduled to bid in 2018, and that's 9,700 foot of 18-foot diameter tunnel. So currently out there, the project that's going on in the Deep Rock Tunnel Connector is Shea Kiwa Joint Venture. They have a contract value of $180 million. And this project, again, is the first phase of the Dig Indy tunnel system. They began work in 2012. In July of 2014, they finished tunneling 7.5 miles of tunnel in 17 months. They set a couple of records on this job through dolomite and limestone. And 2 things to notice. June 12th, they achieved the most advanced mine in 1 day, which was 409.8 feet, and July of 2013, most advanced in a week, 1,690 feet, and most advanced mine in 1 month of 5,755 feet. So use all those numbers when you bid your jobs out there. Again, this project is set to complete in May of 2016. You'll definitely be the low bidder on it, so. And here's some photographs of their tunnel out there. That's their holing through on July of 2014. So again, here's some of the ones I covered before, giving you the bid dates of when the other runs are going to be coming out for bid. The next area that has a major tunneling project going on is 3 major tunnelings is part of the Columbus, Ohio Clean Rivers project. Right now there's the Orsh Tunnel going on, and then there's 2 more tunnels that are slated to bid next year on their work. So on the first project, Kenny Obayashi was the low bidder on it. They had a $264 million job on phase 1. Phase 2, Trumbull Corp had a project for $90 million on it. Some of the facts on the Orr's job, Phase 1 began in 2010 and involved digging a 20-foot diameter tunnel, total length of 23,000 feet, and there was also 3 shafts in that. Phase 2 began in 2011 and it required the digging of 3 additional shafts, the pump station, electrical building, and some overflow items. The tunnel was about 4.5 miles long and was built in bedrock at a depth of 170 feet. All shafts were 100 foot deep and embedded 5 foot into limestone. The only work remaining on phase 2 right now is finishing off shaft 4, and shaft 5 has a couple more vertical lifts of lining to be done in their shafts. Phase 1 all the shafts for them have been completed. Construction delays have pushed back the completion of the tunnel portion, and the progress began slow when there was a lot of groundwater encountered. Project is currently about 1.5 years behind schedule, and it's about 3 miles of the 4 have been excavated. It's scheduled to be completed in 2017. One of the other problems out there during the construction was for one of the shafts, there was a major grouting program that had to be taken into account. You can see from the geology there some of the fractures that were encountered, and it was an extensive grouting program that was undertaking there. The next one. These are the future jobs in Columbus coming out that are bidding 2012. I kind of mentioned them early on there. Next area to go to is Cleveland. So Cleveland has several tunnels that are being bid on it right now. And what the work is out there, it's a clean water initiative taken by them. It's a 25-year program that's designed to reduce the pollution into Lake Erie, and it involves 7 large tunnels. It's going to be a total of 21 miles of tunnel, cost of $1.3 billion. It enables Cleveland to meet the Clean Water Act standards and address the water quality issues that are caused by raw sewage overflows that have been happening during rain events. The 7 tunnels ranging from 2 to 5 miles in length and up to 300 feet underground. I don't know what happened to my thing here. Will be used. These tunnels are similar and to the nearly complete Mill Creek Tunnel, a structure with the capacity to store 75 million gallons of sewage. And the first phase on that job was the Euclid Creek Tunnel. That was Kiewit-McNally Tunnel that was completed the major tunneling was completed in August of 2013, and they're just finishing up some of the items on it. The project is designed to reduce the overflows from happening between 14 to 63 times a year down to less than 6 times a year. So here's some photos from the Euclid Creek Tunnel. Again, this tunnel was between 190 and 220 feet deep. It was 18,000 foot long. It's going to have 70 million gallons of capacity, and there was 5 shafts on there. Here's a photograph of a 30-ton rebar frame that they're lowering into one of the shafts to connect the shaft with the tunnel, and then they would place the concrete on that. There was also some work done on there, some other a relief sewer that had to be put in, which was done with a TBM machine. And then the next Dugway Tunnel in Cleveland, Ohio, was a project awarded in November 2014, just getting underway, and it's $153 million. This job here is designed to keep about 1 billion gallons of sewage out of the brook in Lake Erie, happening over a yearly basis. And this will also include several sewers, diversion structures, and drop shafts to capture future CSO and different areas where it services. The tunnel was going to be constructed with the TBM. at depths over 200 foot deep. It also includes the 6 shafts, which vary in depths and diameters. Construction is scheduled to start the end of this year and should last for about 50 months. And this is one of the next ones coming out here that bids in 2020 in Cleveland. It's 12,300 feet. And then in 2021, there is the shoreline storage tunnel, 16,000 foot of tunnel, again, 5 years down the road. And then the Big Creek storage tunnel, I'll be retired then in 2026, which is 19,000 feet long. So while we're hitting on some of the future tunneling work, in Baltimore, they have the Red Line coming out, which the Cook's Lane Tunnel and Downtown Tunnel, both are scheduled to be bidding this year with lengths of 14,000 and 36,000. They're 22 foot deep. And the proposed Red Line, it's an east-west transit line connected in the areas of Woodlawn, downtown Baltimore, West Baltimore, and Harbor East. It includes 19 stations, 5 of which will be underground. The 14-mile section includes 2 tunneled sections, the Cook's Lane and Downtown tunnels, again, totaling 4.7 miles. Construction is supposed to continue till 2022. And there's also in Baltimore the Purple Line, which is scheduled to be bid this year. It's a 1,000-foot long section, 30 by 40 tunnel. Other things that are still hanging out there is the Gateway Tunnel from Newark, allegedly bidding next year. Proposed length is 14,600 feet. See where that one goes. Then there's the Cross Harbor Tunnel, which proposed length of 25,000 feet, 30 foot wide. Really don't know when that one's coming out for bid. And then it's up in Boston, 2018. They're putting in the Silver Line extension from South Station up to the airport. And the city of Hartford has their combined CSO outfall, which is a 16,000 foot long tunnel scheduled to bid in 2015. And then out in Ohio, the city of Akron has a job bidding this year, 6,000 foot long, 27 foot CSO job 2. And Ohio, 2021, there's some more work coming out there. And that's it.